This is the satisfiable image they tried to bury. Picture a room in Mumbai, not a hotel ballroom, not a diplomatic photo op, but a war room. Maps on the walls, trade routes highlighted in red, 30 flags pinned to a corkboard, each one representing a nation that has decided as of this morning, Thursday, February 27th, 2026, at approximately 9:15 a.m. India Standard Time, that the United States of America is no longer a reliable trading partner. For the first time in modern history, 2.5 billion people across 30 nations are now aligned in an economic coalition designed to root around the American economy like it is a broken highway. This is not a sanctions regime. This is not a military alliance. This is something far more dangerous. It is a financial bypass surgery on the world's largest economy, and the surgeon is holding the scalpel right now. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney landed in Mumbai this morning to a reception that looked more like a state visit for a wartime ally than a routine trade mission. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, fresh off signing what the Europeans are calling the mother of all deals, a $27 trillion free trade zone with the European Union covering 2 billion people, has now turned his attention to Canada, Australia, Japan, and a constellation of middle powers stretching from Southeast Asia to South America. We are talking about the EU's 27 member states. We are talking about India with 1.4 billion consumers. We are talking about Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Brazil, and the Indo-Pacific bloc. We are talking about a combined GDP that dwarfs America's. Sources inside the Indian Ministry of External Affairs say the framework being discussed this week goes far beyond bilateral trade. It is a multilateral economic architecture built explicitly to reduce dependence on the United States. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how this coalition formed. We are going to explain the financial mechanics that make it lethal. We are going to show you why the Supreme Court's tariff ruling last Friday made this inevitable. And we are going to answer the question nobody in Washington wants to ask. What happens when 2.5 billion people decide they don't need America anymore? Buckle up. The world is being redrawn in real time. To understand why Mark Carney is sitting across from Narendra Modi this morning instead of negotiating with Washington, you have to go back exactly 1 week to Friday, February 20th, 2026 at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That is when the United States Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. Learning resources. Incourse versus Trump. The decision did not merely clip the president's wings, it eviscerated the entire legal foundation of American trade policy for the past 14 months. Every reciprocal tariff, every fentanyl-related levy on Canada, Mexico, and China, every punitive duty on Indian goods that reached as high as 50%, all of it struck down as unconstitutional overreach. Here is what you need to understand about the scale of destruction. The Tax Foundation estimates that more than $160 billion in tariffs were collected illegally under IEPA authority between January 2025 and the ruling date. Penn Wharton's budget model projects up to $175 billion in potential refunds owed to importers. The tariffs would have raised $1.4 trillion over the next decade. That revenue is gone, vaporized. And the president's response was not contrition or recalibration. Within hours of the ruling, Donald Trump invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, slapping a new 10% global tariff on all imports. By Saturday, February 21st, he had raised it to 15%, the maximum allowed under that statute. But here is the catch. Section 122 tariffs expire in 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. That means these tariffs have a kill date of July 24th, 2026, right before the midterm elections. Every member of Congress will have to vote on the record whether to tax American consumers at the grocery store and the car dealership. Now, let me explain why this legal chaos is the detonator for the coalition forming in Mumbai right now. For the past year, country after country negotiated trade deals with the Trump administration specifically to get lower tariff rates. India agreed to reduce tariffs on American industrial goods to 0 in exchange for the U.S., dropping its rate from 25% to 18%. Modi committed to buying $500 billion worth of American energy, technology, and defense products. Japan pledged $550 billion in U.S. investment to get its rate lowered to 15%. The EU signed a deal to cap tariffs at 15% in exchange for eliminating duties on American industrial goods. But the Supreme Court ruling pulled the legal rug out from under every single one of these deals. The IEEPA authority those deals were negotiated under no longer exists. India immediately paused its trade delegation to Washington. The European Parliament postponed its ratification vote for the second time. South Korea demanded consultations. Japan is reportedly furious, having committed $550 billion to a deal that now carries the same tariff rate as countries that committed nothing. Sources close to the Indian Trade Ministry describe the mood as one of profound betrayal. According to leaked briefings from the Ministry of External Affairs, India's negotiators feel they were pressured into making massive concessions, buying $500 billion in American goods, agreeing to stop purchasing Russian oil, only to watch the legal basis for those concessions disintegrate 6 days later. The calculus in New Delhi shifted overnight. Why negotiate with Washington when the president's own Supreme Court says his trade authority is illegal? Why commit to buying American when the tariff rate changes every 48 hours? As one senior Indian diplomat reportedly told colleagues, "We are done being hostages to American domestic chaos." That is the sentence that launched this coalition. What Carney and Modi are building this week is not a simple trade deal. It is the architecture for a parallel economic system. Here is how the financial plumbing works. First, the EU-India Free Trade Agreement signed on January 27th at Hyderabad House in New Delhi created a tariff-free zone covering 2 billion people and $27 trillion in combined GDP. Under this deal, tariffs on 96.6% of EU goods exported to India will be eliminated or reduced, saving European exporters $4.7 billion annually. India gets access to 144 EU services subsectors. European automakers like Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW see their tariffs on cars exported to India drop from 110% to 10%. India, now the world's third-largest car market, becomes the growth engine for European manufacturing. Second, Canada is negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with India that aims to more than double bilateral trade from $30.8 billion to $70 billion by 2030. Carney's government has already signed a preliminary trade agreement with China to reduce tariffs on electric vehicles and canola oil. Canada is the fourth largest crude oil exporter in the world. India is a price-sensitive market desperate to diversify away from both American and Russian energy. A uranium supply deal worth approximately $2.8 billion over 10 years is expected to be announced during this trip. Canada supplies the fuel. India builds nuclear power plants. The Americans are cut out of the equation entirely. Third, Australia has signed its own trade deal with India, eliminating tariffs on all Indian exports, while India removed duties on 90% of Australian goods. Fourth, the EU and a 12-nation Indo-Pacific bloc led by Canada are reportedly in talks to form a major global economic alliance. This is the architecture, not one deal. A web of interlocking agreements that create alternative supply chains, alternative energy partnerships, and alternative financial flows that do not pass through American hands. But here is what nobody is talking about. The real weapon in this coalition is not tariff reduction, it is tariff certainty. The Brookings Institution published an analysis this week arguing that the central problem with American trade policy is not the tariff rate itself, but the instability surrounding it. Over the past year, businesses were forced to make hiring, pricing, and investment decisions against a backdrop of tariff rates that changed with little notice. The U.S. average effective tariff rate climbed to nearly 17%, the highest since the early 1930s. Research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that nearly 90% of those costs were borne by American firms and consumers. The Tax Foundation estimates tariffs added approximately $1,300 to household costs in 2026. Meanwhile, India's deals with the EU, Canada, Australia, and the UK offer something the United States cannot: predictability, a fixed tariff schedule, a legal framework that does not depend on the mood of a single executive or the whims of a 48-year-old emergency statute. For a global manufacturer choosing between setting up a factory in a country with a stable 5% tariff and a country where the rate might be 10% today, 25% tomorrow, and 0% next month, the choice is obvious. Capital flows to certainty. Capital flees chaos. It gets worse. The geopolitical implications of this coalition are staggering. Consider what has happened in the span of 30 days. India signed the largest free trade agreement in its history with the European Union. India then signed a framework deal with the United States that included commitments to stop buying Russian oil. The Supreme Court struck down the legal basis for that deal. India paused its trade delegation to Washington. And now India is hosting Canada's Prime Minister to discuss an economic partnership explicitly designed to reduce dependence on the United States. Modi is playing three-dimensional chess while Washington is playing checkers. He signed the EU deal to lock in European market access. He signed the US deal to get tariffs lowered from 50% to 18%. When the Supreme Court blew up the American deal, he pivoted to Canada and Australia within days. India is not choosing sides. India is building optionality, and optionality is power. The White House response has been, according to sources inside the West Wing, a mixture of denial and fury. Trump, during his State of the Union address on Tuesday, February 24th, defended his tariff agenda, even as the Supreme Court ruling cast fresh confusion over every trade deal his administration had negotiated. He warned countries against backing away from previously signed agreements, posting on Truth Social that any nation that wants to play games would face much higher duties under different trade laws. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer announced the administration expects to open new Section 301 investigations into several countries. But Section 301 requires formal trade investigations before tariffs can be imposed. Those investigations take months, sometimes years. The 150-day clock on Section 122 tariffs is already ticking. By the time Section 301 investigations produce actionable results, the coalition being built in Mumbai will have hardened into permanent infrastructure. Let me push the scenario to the extreme. Sources inside the Indian Ministry of Commerce suggest that the endgame is not merely bilateral trade diversification. It is the creation of a settlement system that reduces reliance on the US dollar for trade between coalition members. This is not happening tomorrow, but the conversations are happening now. India already conducts a significant portion of its trade with Russia in rupees rather than dollars. The EU has been building its own payment infrastructure since 2018 to reduce dollar dependency. If India, the EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the Indo-Pacific bloc begin settling even 20% of their internal trade in non-dollar currencies, the demand for U.S. Treasury bonds drops. The cost of American borrowing rises. The federal deficit, already hemorrhaging at $2 trillion annually, becomes unsustainable faster. This is the nuclear option, not a military strike. A financial reorientation that slowly bleeds American economic supremacy over a decade. The psychological dimension of this crisis is something the mainstream media is completely ignoring. For 80 years, since Bretton Woods in 1944, the United States has been the indispensable nation in global trade. Every country needed access to American markets. Every country needed American dollars. Every country needed American goodwill. What is happening in Mumbai this morning is the first credible, large-scale attempt to build an alternative. Not by enemies, not by China or Russia, by allies, by Canada, the country that shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States, by India, the country Trump called his greatest friend 3 weeks ago, by the European Union, NATO's economic backbone. The betrayal is not that these countries are turning hostile. The betrayal is that American trade policy has become so erratic, so legally unstable, so fundamentally unreliable that allies are hedging their bets. Mark Carney said it best at Davos in January. The old order is fading. Canada should not expect it to return once this president leaves office. That is not anger. That is strategic clarity, and it is devastating. Here is what this means for ordinary Americans watching this from their living rooms. When 2.5 billion people build trade routes that bypass the United States, American exporters lose markets. American farmers lose buyers. American manufacturers lose supply chain partners. The soybean farmer in Iowa, whose product currently flows to India, faces competition from Canadian canola and Australian wheat sold under preferential tariff agreements that America is not party to. The auto worker in Michigan competes against European cars manufactured in Indian factories under a tariff schedule that makes them cheaper than American models. The tech worker in Silicon Valley watches as Indian and European AI partnerships develop next-generation systems without American participation. The coalition does not need to explicitly punish the United States. It simply needs to make America irrelevant to the fastest-growing trade flows on Earth. And that process is already underway. The historical parallels are haunting. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising duties on more than 20,000 imported goods. The result was not American prosperity. The result was global retaliation, collapsing trade volumes, and the worst economic depression in modern history. World trade fell by 65% between 1929 and 1934. The lesson was so searing that it gave birth to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the precursor to the World Trade Organization, and to the entire post-war economic order that made America the center of global commerce. We are now watching that order be dismantled, not by foreign adversaries, but by American policy decisions that have pushed allies into building alternatives. History teaches us that trade architecture, once redirected, does not come back. When Britain lost its position as the center of global trade in the early 20th century, it never recovered that status. The infrastructure of commerce is like concrete. It hardens. How does this play with the MAGA base? The answer is complicated. The core supporters see tariffs as strength, as America putting itself first, as a rejection of globalist deals that shipped jobs overseas, and there is a legitimate grievance there. American workers were genuinely harmed by decades of trade policy that prioritized corporate profits over domestic employment. But the coalition forming in Mumbai exposes the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. Tariffs were supposed to bring leverage. Tariffs were supposed to force countries to deal on American terms. Instead, the Supreme Court blew up the legal authority. The replacement tariffs expire in 150 days, and 30 nations are building a parallel system that makes American leverage weaker, not stronger. The donors see this. The Wall Street money sees this. The CEOs who were supposed to invest in American manufacturing see this. If the coalition hardens before November's midterms, the narrative flips from America first to America alone. What does Xi Jinping see when he looks at this picture? He sees vindication. For years, Beijing has argued that the American-led trading system was a tool of coercion, that Washington used the dollar and market access as weapons. Now, America's own allies are saying the same thing. Carney's Davos speech about middle powers resisting subordination by great powers was aimed at Washington, not Beijing. Modi's decision to sign the EU deal was driven in part by Trump's 50% tariffs on Indian goods. When the United States makes itself unpredictable, it does not project strength. It projects instability. And instability is the one thing that global capital cannot tolerate. Every CEO considering a $10 billion factory investment is asking the same question this morning. Do I build in a country with a stable trade framework, or do I build in a country where the rules change every time a judge issues a ruling or a president fires off a social media post at 3 a.m.? The Supreme Court's role in this crisis cannot be overstated. The 6-3 ruling in Learning Resources versus Trump was not a partisan decision. Chief Justice Roberts was joined by Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Jackson. This was a separation of powers ruling that said the power to tax, including the power to impose tariffs, belongs to Congress, not the president. EPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties, Roberts wrote. The government points to no statute in which Congress used the word regulate to authorize taxation, and until now, no president has read IEPA to confer such power. The dissent from Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito warned that the ruling could require the government to refund billions of dollars to importers and would unravel trillions of dollars in trade deals. Both things are now happening simultaneously. The stress test is this: can the United States maintain its position as the center of global trade when its own Supreme Court says the president's trade authority was illegal? Can American businesses plan for the future when tariff rates change 3 times in a single week? Can allies trust trade deals when the legal basis for those deals can be struck down by 6 justices any given Friday? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the questions being asked right now in boardrooms in Mumbai, in parliament buildings in Canberra, in finance ministries in Tokyo, in the European Commission headquarters in Brussels. And the answer they are arriving at, collectively, is no, not anymore. The system that made America indispensable was built on reliability, on the rule of law, on the idea that a deal with the United States meant something. That foundation has cracked, and the water is rushing through. So as we head into this weekend, watch the feeds. Watch for the joint communique from Carney and Modi expected on Sunday, March 2nd from Hyderabad House in New Delhi. Watch for the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement framework to be announced. Watch for the uranium deal. Watch for the announcements from Carney's subsequent stops in Canberra and Tokyo. Watch for the European Parliament's reconvening on March 4th to decide whether to ratify the EU-US trade deal or walk away. And watch the congressional clock. The Section 122 tariffs expire July 24th. Every day between now and then is a day the coalition grows stronger while American leverage grows weaker. The response from this White House will not be a diplomatic olive branch. Sources close to the administration say the president views the coalition as a personal betrayal by leaders he considered friends. Expect escalation. Expect threats of 100% tariffs on Canada, which Trump has already previewed. Expect accusations that Modi is playing both sides. Expect Truth Social posts at midnight threatening to withdraw military cooperation. But the threats are the tell. They reveal that Washington understands what is happening and has no effective countermeasure. You cannot tariff your way out of a coalition that was built specifically to be tariff-proof. We are witnessing the most significant realignment of global trade since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. The maps are being redrawn, the supply chains are being rerouted, the financial architecture is being rebuilt, and the country that built the original system, the country that wrote the rules, the country that profited most from those rules for 8 decades, is being routed around like a collapsed bridge on a highway. Not because the world hates America, but because the world has decided that America is no longer a stable partner. That is the legacy being written in Mumbai this morning. 2.5 billion people, 30 nations, and one message: we will build our own road. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The trade maps of the 21st century are being drawn this weekend, and they may not include the United States. The coalition is forming, the architecture is hardening, and the clock, as always, is ticking.